Hello, and welcome to Basics for Gamers presents the basics of identifying monsters in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. When players encounter a creature they do not recognize, or more appropriately, when their characters encounter such a monster, as separating player knowledge from character knowledge is very important here, they may attempt skill checks to see what information they know about the creature. This is a recall knowledge check, requires one action, and can be attempted untrained. On a success, the player learns the name of the target species and the single most commonly known but so far unrevealed trait about the creature. This is entirely up to the GM to determine, but the rulebook uses trolls as an example. On a successful recall knowledge check, the player learns that the target creature is a troll and that they have regeneration that can be halted by acid or fire. On a critical success, they also learn an additional little-known piece of information about the target. Again, this is entirely up to the GM to decide, but continuing the example of a troll, on a critical success, the character might also learn that trolls are known to make attacks of opportunity. Also note that the GM may limit the knowledge given according to the proficiency level of the character making the check. For example, an untrained character may not be able to reveal very obscure information about the target no matter how high they roll. There are no concrete rules for determining what information is granted at each proficiency level, and this will require the GM to make a judgment call regarding what is appropriate information for each proficiency level. And although not spelled out in the rules, so consider this a house rule, some GMs will also reveal the creature's type and subtype traits on a successful check, and the type and subtype traits are going to be the traits found in red when looking at a monster's stat block. In the case of trolls, they belong to the giant type and the troll subtype. On a failure, the player learns nothing, and on a critical failure, they learn incorrect or misleading information. Maybe they mistake the troll for a marsh giant and therefore don't know that it has regeneration abilities. But before rolling that check, you need to know which skill to use. By default, the skills you use to identify a creature are based on its traits. The table on page 505 spells it out for you. Arcana is used to identify beasts, constructs, dragons, and elementals. Crafting is used to identify constructs. Nature is used to identify animals, beasts, elementals, fae, fungi, and plants. Occultism is used to identify aberrations, astral beings, creatures with the ethereal trait, oozes, and spirits. Religion is used to identify celestial beings, fiends, monitors such as psychopomps, and the undead. And society is used to identify and know details about the various humanoid ancestries that inhabit Golarion. And note that we're talking about the humanoid trait here, not the creature's shape. A zombie may have 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head, but they're not considered to be, quote, humanoids in game terms. So, for example, if players encounter a manticore, they could use either the Arcana or Nature skills to identify it, since manticores have the beast trait. In addition, players can also use the appropriate lore skill to identify creatures. So, as another example, either religion or lore undead could be used to identify a vampire. At the GM's discretion, they may also be able to use other related skills. Hags are humanoids, and therefore you would use society to identify them. But hags are also known for their occult spell use, so a GM might allow occultism in place of society. It is also possible to gain knowledge about a creature using skills other than the listed knowledge and lore skills. This will be entirely up to the GM, but if a character has the ability or skill that they are trying to assess, then they might be able to use a skill to see if the target creature has the same ability or to what degree. For example, if a character is trained in athletics, and wants to know if they can outrun a monster, they might be able to roll athletics instead of a knowledge skill, but they would use their intelligence modifier for the bonus instead of strength for that check. Once you know what skill needs to be rolled, the next question is what DC needs to be beat to score a success. This is fairly easy. Simply compare the level of the creature to table 10.5 found on page 503 of the core rules, and then modify by the creature's rarity. Common creatures use the listed DC, increase the DC by 2 for uncommon creatures, by 5 for rare creatures, and by 10 for unique creatures. And then lower the DC if a lore skill is being used instead of one of the general knowledge skills. This reduction is either 2 points lower or 5 points lower at the GM's discretion. For example, Niliths are common 10th level aberrations, so identifying one would call for a DC 27 occultism check. Cyclops are uncommon 5th level humanoids, so it would take a DC 22 society check to identify one of them, and if using the lore Cyclops skill instead of society, the DC may be lowered to 17. Things get a little more tricky when talking about unique creatures. Rules as written, unique creatures have a DC that is 10 higher than what's listed for their level on the table. But I think this is one of those areas where the GM really needs to leverage their own insights. If the creature has the unique tag because they are an individual member of a species like Warble Bumblebrasher is, then by raw, the DC to identify her is 25, 15 for being first level, plus 10 more for having the unique trait. Although not spelled out in the rules, I believe the intention here is for it to be a DC 15 society check to know that you're looking at a goblin, and a DC 25 check to recognize her as a specific goblin named Warble Bumblebrasher. And the GM may lower the DC to know that Warble is a goblin due to the standard goblin being a level -1 creature. Again, this is all up to the GM to make a judgment call. The GM also needs to ask themselves, if Warble is a goblin of great renown in the community, then wouldn't it be easier to identify her? If that's the case, the DC may be lower to know her name, but would likely still be DC 25 to know that she's deadly accurate when throwing her heavy books as ranged weapons. Again, the GM will need to use some common sense and their own interpretations when managing the DCs to identify unique creatures. That's the gist of how to identify a monster. You use recall knowledge with an applicable skill versus a DC that's based on the creature's level and rarity. If successful, you know what kind of creature they are and their name if they're unique, and also the single most commonly known piece of information about them. And if you critically succeed, you also learn one piece of little known information too. But what if that's not enough? What if you need to know more information? You can continue to spend one action and make one skill check, but with 2 restrictions. First, as soon as a character fails a recall knowledge check, they cannot make any further checks on that subject. At that point, the GM has revealed all the information they know about that creature. And second, the DC increases by 1 difficulty level with every additional check. So, for example, if you succeed your first check against the regular DC, you learn the monster's name and the most commonly known piece of information about it. If you spend another action, this becomes a hard check, increases the DC by 2, and if successful, the GM provides the next most commonly known piece of information. If they succeed, they can make a third check at +5. If they fail that check, they're done. But if they succeed, they can make one last check at incredibly hard difficulty with a +10 DC. This is the last check that they can make. Regardless of success or failure, after they make this check, the GM will have revealed all the information they know about this creature. And note that if the character is using a lore skill, then they start at either easy or very easy on this chart. This is where that -2 or -5 reduction to DC I previously mentioned comes from, which means you have more potential checks that can be made with lore skills, as it will take a person starting at very easy 6 recall knowledge actions to max out their knowledge of a creature versus 4 attempts when using a general knowledge skill and standard DC. Although the rules provide an excellent framework for learning the names and abilities of monsters, it is a process that relies heavily on GM interpretation and judgment calls. So next I want to share a few house rules I've seen GMs use to manage the system with their groups, and as always when discussing house rules, remember these are not official and what works for one group may not be what works best for yours. The first house rule is the GM rolls these checks in secret, much like how perception and stealth checks are always rolled in secret. The main advantage to this is the player doesn't know when they've critically failed a check. Otherwise, when they do roll a critical failure, they usually know that the information the GM is giving them is false. Another house rule I've seen used is awarding more information based on degrees of success. Instead of success granting the most commonly known piece of information and a critical success being that plus 1 piece of little known information, the GM provides the creature's name and 1 piece of information for succeeding, plus 1 more for every 5 points they beat the DC by. And for repeated checks, the DC becomes the previous check's total, so they have to keep beating their previous rolls to gain more information. This can speed up the process and rewards the players for making excellent rolls, but might feel unbalancing to the GM due to potentially awarding lots of information for only 1 spin action. And the last house rule I want to share addresses the biggest frustration I see at the table, which occurs when a player succeeded or even critically succeeds the check, but are not awarded with the information they really want. If a player desperately needs to know if a creature is immune to fire damage before they use their highest level spell slot to cast a massive fireball, it can be frustrating to have to burn multiple actions in making numerous knowledge checks until the GM decides that the monster's immunities would be the next most commonly known piece of information and then awards it. So in this variation, instead of the GM granting information based on what they feel is most commonly known, they instead invite the players to ask questions. If the player succeeds their check, then the GM will provide the monster's name and also say, "I will answer any one question you have about this monster," and then let the player spin that opportunity to ask if the monster is immune to fire damage. This method is definitely more powerful than what is provided in the rules, but some groups prefer it. And in my own experience, this greatly reduces player frustration and can also be fun when that player asks a question out of left field. In this video, we discussed the basics of identifying monsters. Players may attempt recall knowledge checks to reveal secret information about a creature. On a success, they learn the creature's species and possibly its name if it is unique, and also learn 1 piece of unrevealed information. This is determined by the GM and should be the most commonly known but so far unrevealed detail about the target. On a critical success, the player also learns 1 little known unrevealed piece of information. On a failure, they receive no information and may not attempt any further checks to identify the target. And on a critical failure, they receive incorrect or misleading information as determined by the GM. The skill that is used for these checks is primarily based on the target's type trait as per the table on page 505 of the core rules, but may be substituted for a different skill, possibly with a different DC at the GM's discretion. The DC for the check is based on the creature's level per table 10.5 found on page 503 and further modified by its rarity. Also, when using a lore skill, instead of one of the general knowledge skills, the DC should be reduced by either 2 or 5, making it either an easy or very easy difficulty check. Players may spend additional actions on more recall knowledge checks, each success providing the next most commonly known but so far unrevealed piece of information. With each additional check, the DC is raised by 1 difficulty level until either the player rolls a failure or after they attempt one incredibly hard difficulty check. Before we close, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of our patrons. These videos would not be possible without their continued generosity and support. Members of the Basics for Gamers Patreon community receive special benefits, like getting to vote on the topics that we cover in the future, and also they get to see these videos 1 week and ad-free before everybody else. Visit the link shown on the left of the screen and in the description if you'd like to know more about becoming a patron. If you would like to support this channel and help it grow, the easiest way to do that is by subscribing and clicking the bell icon so you get notified when new videos release. And we can always be reached through our Twitter and Facebook pages too. Thanks for watching, take care, and we will see you soon with more Basics of Pathfinder.